Hi, I'm Adrian Pappas from AucseearSDrec Biosciences, and today I'm going to show you how to set up a receptor ligand assay on our iCelligence platform. Now the first step, which applies to all of our assays on iCelligence, is to make sure that you have the iPad and iCelligence set up and communicating ready to go. And so in the incubator, I have the iCelligence station here, already pre-equilibrated to 37 degrees Celsius and 5% CO2. And as indicated by the orange light, it is in standby mode and ready to go. And the second component for our iCelligence platform is the iPad, which runs the software. And so here, in order to make sure that the iPad is communicating with the correct station, we'll go to Settings, and under Wi-Fi, we'll select the correct iCelligence station. Now, in the event that you're running multiple stations with one iPad, you'll see here it'll be listed, and the alias will correspond to a serial number. And so the correct one in our case is this third one, which we are connected to. And we are ready to start the software. And so you're immediately prompted to log in, and we'll just be user 1 for now. And we'll click New Experiment. Now here you can choose the 4 predefined assays or a different assay according if these predefined assays don't fit with what you have. But in our case, we're doing the receptor signaling, and we'll start a standard protocol. Now from here, our setup is such that the procedure will measure the first time point, which is the background measurement, which is actually very important. It'll establish our baseline, which our subsequent cell index measurements will be compared to. And so, and after that, an initial 2 hours at 1 minute sweeps, or 1 minute intervals, which will measure the initial attachment and adhesion of our cells onto the plate, as well as 96 hours at 1 hour intervals, just to monitor the overnight proliferation. After that, the next day, or after a certain period of time, depending on your assay, we'll switch over to 2 hours at 1 minute intervals to monitor the initial short-term effects of your compound, as well as 96 hours at 15 minutes to measure your long-term effects from your compounds. So from here, we'll set up our assay such that, in fact, we're only going to use one plate, so we can turn these wells off. And it'll just prompt you to confirm that you don't want to use these wells. Yes. And you can enter your assay parameters as they correspond to your experiment. So in our case, we'll be doing a HeLa histamine assay, and we'll plate around 24,000 cells per well. Okay, and you're ready to start your background measurement. So you can see here the button is grayed out, meaning that no plate is actually engaged yet and is not ready to start. But once we put the plate in, it'll turn green, and then we'll be ready to start. So in general, in order to set up and run your receptor signaling assay, you only need standard tissue culture reagents and equipment. And so here we actually have our tissue culture pipettemen, or pipettes. We have the reagents associated with our cell type, PBS, trypsin, as well as this full media. We have cell reservoirs for plating. We have our multi-channel pipette, as well as P20 for cell counting, pipettemen, as well as your pipette tips, and the actual E-plate. As I mentioned earlier, the first step is to take your background measurement. So in our case, we'll be adding 150 microliters of just plain media without cells into each of the wells. Now in general, we recommend going no lower than 150 microliters. And this is just to ensure that the entire bottom of the well is in fact covered once you obtain your background measurement. Alright, and then from here, in order to just make sure that the entire bottom of the well is covered, you can perform a visual inspection, and if not, then you can just simply tap the side of the plate in order to make sure all the media is in fact coating the bottom of the plate. So now we're ready to obtain our first measurement. So the plate is engaged, as indicated by the green light. It's ready to go, and the station does recognize the plate. And if you turn over to the software on the iPad now, you can see that the play button is actually green, meaning it's ready to go and engaged. So from here we can actually start our experiment. Immediately you're prompted to name your experiment, and you can use just the generic default, which corresponds to just the date as well as a certain serial number. So click OK. And you're immediately prompted to the analysis page, which shows your plot. And as you can see, as you add the wells, our first measurement has been taken. And so this will provide our origin essentially for our experiment. And once we add cells on, you'll see your cell index change in reference to this point here. So from this point on, we're ready to add our cells. We need to remove the plate from the station. So now that we've taken our first initial background measurement, we're actually ready to add our cells onto the E-plate. And so here, assuming we have our cells in suspension already, they're at such a density, or they're at a density such that we're going to be plating 300 microliters into each well. And so they'll just be calculated accordingly. And in general, you just want to make sure you have nice homogeneous cell suspension, which entails pipetting up and down extensively. Okay. Since I have a P200 as multi-channel, I'll just be pipetting 150 microliters twice. If you had a P1000, then it would be much easier, but whatever your cell preference is in terms of plating. And that's it. And so from here, we'll leave this plate at room temperature underneath the tissue culture hood for 30 minutes. This is just to ensure homogeneous cell seeding at the bottom of the plate. And after that 30 minutes incubation, we'll put it back onto the station and we'll monitor it overnight for growth. And after overnight incubation, we'll add our compounds. So now that the 30 minutes are up, we're ready to put it back onto the station. And it is engaged, as indicated by the green light again. And we go back to the iPad. And we're actually ready to start the overnight monitoring of our cell index. So you can see the second reading has been taken with the cells in there, and we'll just let this go for the duration of the night. Welcome back to the receptor signaling assay. Last night we plated our cells and monitored the cell index overnight. And so as you can see in the software, we actually established quite a nice baseline from which we can actually normalize the cell index from once you add your compounds. And so from this point on, we have our cells growing nicely. We have a nice growth curve. We're actually ready to add the compounds. Now fortunately, with the iCelligence platform, there are two ways you could do this. One which we term on the fly, meaning taking your compounds out from underneath your tissue culture hood, bringing it straight to the incubator. And the cradle design is such that you can actually remove the lid of the E-plate without having to disengage the device. And so you can pretty much minimize the time in between adding your compound as well as putting it back onto the incubator to start taking your readings. The second way you can actually set up your receptor or signaling assays to actually take the E-plate out, bring it to your tissue culture hood, add your compounds there, and then place it back onto the station. The second thing to note is if you are going to be doing a media exchange, then you could simply have to add just a few more steps in the procedure, or one step in the procedure, to take your E-plate out change the media in the E-plate, put it back, and then monitor it if you want to establish another baseline. But in our case, we're not going to be performing a media exchange, and so we'll just be adding the compounds directly to cells in growth media. So from here, since we're ready to add our compounds, I'll be taking the E-plate out and putting it in underneath the tissue culture hood, adding it there, and then bringing it back. And so from here, we're actually ready to abort this current step. And so it'll prompt you to confirm that you actually want to abort the step. Yes. And from here, you're actually ready to take the plate out from the station. Now, yesterday we plated 150 microliters for the background measurement, as well as 300 microliters for cells, which gives it a total volume inside the E-plate per well at 450 microliters. Today I'll be adding my compounds, which I have prepared here, at 50 microliters to this 450. So the total volume, final volume, will be 500 microliters. And so I have prepared my compounds at 10x, such that once I add 50 and 5 into 450, it'll be a 1 in 10 dilution, and your final concentration will be 1x. Now in general, after adding your compounds, in order to minimize the amount of time underneath the hood and outside from the station, we'll add the compounds and quickly transfer it back to the station and begin monitoring. The idea is if your assay is a very short-term receptor signaling assay, then you want to minimize the amount of time points that you miss after adding your compounds. So, I have my multi-channel, 50 microliters. And after this, I'll quickly return it to the station. Just leave that. So now the plate is in and engaged as indicated by the green light, and we are ready to immediately start recording our assay. So here on the software, we just press play and we're good to go. And here, as I mentioned earlier, it'll initially start to read at 2 hours at 1 minute intervals for your short-term response from your compounds, as well as 96 hours at 1 minute intervals for the long-term effect from your compounds. And from this stage on, after clicking play, you're ready to walk away and let your data acquire and generate. And so that's the receptor signaling assay. In general, as an overview, just to recap, yesterday we plated our cells after taking our initial background measurement. We let the cells grow overnight in order to establish a nice baseline in which we can normalize our cell index. And today we came back after our nice cell index, and depending on your assay, if you wanted to perform a media exchange, I talked to you how to do that. Just simply add steps to your procedure, do your media exchange, and then add your compounds again. And then in general, we went over the addition of your compounds as well. And so that's receptor signaling for you. Tune into our other videos where I go over the steps necessary in order to perform the cell QC, adhesion, and proliferation and cytotoxicity assays as well. And I'll show you how to do those step by step. I'm Adrian Pappas from 1Aucseear Biosciences. Thank you for watching.